So the curiosity to research the ideas behind reversibility, how do these, like, you know, when you say, when you start from a view, from a standpoint of view that things are reversible.
Yeah, but you know, look, you see, that's the thing. I have been trained in the field of cybernetics, right? So in the cybernetics, it's about systems, right? It's about systems, about processes, and you always want to identify what would be the key process, the master process for that particular system, right? So, and obviously, you know, the master process for any kind of musculoskeletal disease, the master process would be the reversibility of the elementary degenerative changes.
But what stands behind this?
Now that's how things unpack. You know, if that was that simple, you know, but my point was that I, coming from the cybernetic background, I started knocking at, you know, the medical language and the medical doors and so on. And that was the thing that I found there. That point one, that to my ultimate surprise, nobody was actually, you know, it's not that a textbook on whatever, on musculoskeletal conditions, on the physical therapy and so on, starts with the claim, okay, guys, you know, let's say our fundamental goal is to get the reversibility, and this is what we know about reversibility so far. No, they don't start like this, right? And then, you know, they would say, okay, thus our goal is to get the reversibility, but so far we don't know how it goes, so we put our best minds there, but the rest of the textbook is going to be about our temporary stopgap measures that we so far unfortunately have to do to kind of to get the best under these unfortunate circumstances.
Wow.
So that's what should be the opening of any textbook, any medical text, right? So you see, that should be the introduction, because otherwise,
but
whatever they say,
once you say degenerative, it means it cannot generate again.
I mean, but you see, now we go further, right? So you see, because if you get the degenerative, fortunately, the language gives us an offer and saying, well, if it's degenerative, that means that there are probably the regenerative processes, they have not been very successful, right?
Right.
So, you know, it's the question of, it's, you know, the moment you ask the right question, then you see, and that's the thing. Like, again, for me, that was the point. Like, I am not a therapist in my mindset, right? I'm not, you see, but that's why when people ask me, are you particularly proud of helping, you know, X number of families and so on and so on? I mean, look, I'm happy for them. You know, I'm happy when I'm able to help, you know, because basically these children, their life is hard, right? So you see, and there's families, their life is hard, right? So you see, and when I'm, you know, helping them with reducing their struggles, right? And helping them to kind of get happy and so on a human level, I mean, I kind of appreciate it, but it's not that something that makes me kind of overly excited. You know, it's a byproduct of my reasoning. That's it.
I think you underestimate your reasoning and reduce it to something very scientific, but
I mean, again, of course, you know, like we can move further.
Yeah,
you know,
you can be a very one can be a very melodramatic and sentimental, and he helps nothing. So
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Unfortunately, you know, like when it comes to rehabilitation, that's a lot of people with the good hearts, but you know, they have very little brains, you know, let's put it like this, right? So you see, like they just keep doing the same thing that they've been doing a few hundred years back.
Yeah,
So
more of the same, and the same
yeah, that's it. Exactly. So that's how it came to me. You know, for me, it was a combination of things. Okay, I got fascinated with movements, right? So you see, with the study of the movements, without knowing anything about fascia, without any realization that I accidentally stumbled into this premuscular thing, right? I was just honestly, you see what I was doing there. I was just doing those comparisons. And you see, look, if you take a movement of a regular person, right, and kind of just put it through that frame by frame thing, most of the time there wouldn't be much of the interesting things there. So it will basically look like just the,
Yeah.
like the snapshots in time of a rather smooth movement.
These,
Now,
these are the processes in nature. Very
yeah, but
slow.
but wait. See, it's a nuance, right? So you see, for example, if we take the movement of a regular person, it's not going to be much of the interesting thing, even if we divide it, unless we know what to look at. But there was not going to be much of the interesting thing unless we, even if we divide it in this kind of sector by sector thing with those, say, 1/5 of a second or quarter of a second intervals, right? But
Yes.
if you take the movement of this channel with a CP, then it's a very interesting thing, because basically it goes through kind of very weird angle transitions and so on and so on and so forth. So every movement is different. Every quarter second, or
Wow.
make it, 1/10 of a second, every one of them brings something different. They're not the same. They're kind of, it's a very complex path.
Yeah.
And when you see the improvement means that they are usually becoming less.
Spastic.
No, they're becoming less diverse in that sense, right? So
Uh-huh.
they become smoother, they become
Yeah.
closer to the regular one. So
There is more
it's less
flow.
of those strange extras which are happening there.
Mm.
And that's the point. So that's why I was lucky,
Ah,
right? So you see that I started with this, and I started looking at the movements of the individuals with the CP. So because there was material to be seen, right? So you see,
yeah.
imagine if I started just watching the movements of regular people, I wouldn't find much of the interesting stuff there. I wouldn't be interested, right? But I started with the movement of those, and then as I started with those movements, it was much of the interesting things. But then, you know, we were moving into the point I was like seeing a lot of the change in the movement patterns there. But
Mm.
when I was trying to explain, I would say, okay, do we have a language to describe what's happening to those children?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that's where I was completely blown away and flabbergasted. I started looking at the textbooks or whatever, like, okay, what we have, because basically they have a certain standard of presentation of the improvements, and their standard of presentation for the improvements would be the improved ranges of movement in the selective joints. I said,
Wow.
that doesn't make much sense. Look, and that's what they were telling back then, right? So you see that the movements of their CP individuals, they're too complex to be represented as the individual movements, as the individual kind of segments. So we're just going to dismiss this as something which, is too hard to quantify, and so it's not quantifiable. So therefore, we'll just dismiss it. So, guys, who the hell, like, how are you supposed to do this, right? You've got the reality, it's complex. Your current representation language is not good enough
Yeah.
to meet the reality, and then you're telling me, well, we're going to stick to our representation language and going to go and get away with it, going to dismiss the reality. I mean, like, how do you do that?
Yeah. It's
How do you do that?
not no integrity of these
So
kind
I
of.
mean, but that's what medical thinking is. Medical thinking is so fixed, it's so rooted into the standards of presentation and so on. So basically, if you don't fit into the standard of presentation, nobody cares about reality. Nobody going to kind of take an effort or find the ways, to
Mhm.
start studying the reality or start looking at the new representation methods. No, they're going to make, let's say 5,000 studies using the same kind of standard, whatever
Yeah.
spasticity scales from 1 to 5, right? Or, measurements and all
Very,
these things.
very
So,
rigid methods and very
Yeah, so that's it. So basically, complex reality, the complex reality of motion, of movements and, and then transitions is not kind of registerable by those super simple mathematics. And for me, it was like, okay, guys, like, but, you know, you are dealing with the dynamic system and so on and so on. But, we are using, we are dealing with vectors here, right? So you see like vectors, gradients, and so on. And here you're trying to represent vectors with colors, like, vectors with scalars, or in other words, you take vectors or, even vector fields, and you try to represent it just kind of as scalars. Of course, you're going to lose information.
Oh,
Well, but why do you stick to scalars? Just raise your game. Come up, come up with a better language. Get better mathematics. So that was my basically original points, right? So you see, like,
I
okay,
think this makes a real scientist, a pioneer, to dare and
okay, but I was 20, whatever, 21, 22 at the time, 23, 24, like all this.
and yet it takes courage. I know that at our 20s we have um, more passion and daring. We are more courageous and.
Well, I mean, for me, it was just that straightforward. They say like, okay, and fortunately, I just, well, I mean, fortunately, unfortunately, I'm stubborn, to the point of saying, what, look, if this is wrong, this is a dead end, like these people are going to keep representing, they go, instead of taking the reality at what it is, they're going to try to, they're going to stick to their format of representation, even if it distorts reality. They are wrong. And, like, for me, it's just a basic equation. If there, of course, historically, you start with a simpler representation of what you see as simpler reality. But at some point, if reality gets more complex, you have to raise your game and you have to raise the quality of representation. It's that simple. If you don't raise the quality of your representation, you are in trouble. And no matter, no matter how many rubber stamps of approval you have behind it, it's just wrong.
Yeah, I agree. Reality is too complex for the gross tools that we have for
That's
the.
it. But then, of course, the question is that we always have the question of, okay, how do we process the data? How do we mine the data? How do we, we still need to do certain compression of data in order to get the result. I mean, these are good questions, but at least you should first recognize, okay, our current compression is too harsh. We compress the data too much to the point that we obviously distort it so badly with these simple things like just kind of, measuring the muscle strength and measuring the angles of a selective joint, that we are dramatically misrepresenting the reality. So, meaning that we have to do something about it.
That's
We
right.
have to raise our game. You have to articulate this question. We have to
To
talk about it. Like,
evolve, to develop.
evolve. Of course, we don't. And at that point, you don't know what you're going to need to do it. Let's say which kind of other fields of science you need to go to import from there, right? And that was basically my thing. I mean, say if we don't have a good thing here in this field, well, let's go somewhere else, right? And that's again what is the main logic, the main one of the main principles of the cybernetics. You look at, it's a sort of, well, I mean, of course, it's the internal ambition, right? Because cyberneticist, right, or cybernetician is supposed to be the kind of the ultimate generalist. So you're supposed to be sort of seeing systems everywhere. So, and that carries the risk of being too much of a generalist, generalist of everything and specialist of none, right?
Yeah.
So, and that means that you have to kind of specialize somewhere. You have to kind of root yourself to the ground somewhere, right? But on the other hand, the strength of the cybernetics is that, you look at all sciences, because there was a second wave of cybernetics and the third wave and so on. So where you look at the sciences and you say, okay, so this science has this kind of framework this sort of, if you wish, scientific software, you know, which emerged historically, and then the other science has another software. And you know, if the first science has the software which is not so good, or for whatever historical reasons has been weaker, well, you go elsewhere, you take the software from there, shake the particular, you know, material parts, and then plant it there.
Apply it, yeah.
Yeah, then you basically, you just export from there, import from there, and see what's going to happen there.
So it's also
So
the ability to see patterns, to identify.
yeah, that's it. That's what exactly. That's about the ability to see patterns. That's the ability to import languages and so on, and kind of get it, kind of the knowledge arbitrage, right? So you see, then if certain things are already being well explored in some other field, so you have to, you know, find a way how you can transfer them into this field. So you see, that's why, if we kind of get it back, so for me, it was a very, you know, I basically ask the master question. The master question is, how far are we moving in the direction of reversibility? How well we understand it? How well we articulate it? You know, what kind of language of the observation, right? Because if we want to track reversibility, our current language is being extremely poor for that, you know, the measurements of the angles and strengths. So how we can upgrade the language of the representation, so at least we can kind of track more specifically the transformations which are happening. And on the practical side, that's what I told myself, you know, look, if I want to specialize in something, I want to specialize on the cases which are the most complex. Yes, so you see, that means that everything is being present together in a package, and that they would be also, you know, the ones, you know, so therefore it's a something which has started from childhood, right? So you see something that has a neurological component to it, and something which is kind of underdeveloped fundamentally, right?
Right.
And which leaves them not so many options, but the cerebral palsy, right? And the other side of it is that this is the field where you have at least a legitimate expectation about the duration, right? So you see that you are at least legitimately expecting something to take hundreds of hours, right? So you see, if we talk about the physical work, so you have time to work, whilst in the other fields, when you are asking your first question about the, you know, field of the like degenerative disorders of aging and so on and so forth. So this is the field where I believe today, right? So you see things that kind of evolved over the times and so on. So they're very much applicable. And, you know, like we can get a lot better understanding of those, but it's also, you know, it's a package. It's the time, it's the different time budgets, it's the attention budget, it's the expectations and so on and so forth, right? So, you know, but also society has been transforming in this kind of last, whatever, 25, 30 years, so that you get a much more present growth in this kind of mindfulness awareness, right? So you see people willing to observe themselves and so on and so on. So that's kind of a different story, right? So, but overall, for me, it was very simple. I want to go into the CP, right? So you see, I mean, because I don't have any choices, because that's the level of maximum.
Because the movements are very dramatic from second.
Yeah, because that's the more maximum complexity. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's the most kind of readable.
Yeah.
You know, it's the easiest to track.
Yeah.
And it's the one that gives me the largest scale of the time. And then the next thing that I kind of gradually evolved to, and that was first, you know, through my father's formats, is that actually you say, okay, but if I am in the position of exploring the effects of those hundreds of hours per year put into the attempt to deliver the reversibility in this particular child, well, now we have a very tangible question, right? So you see, there is something that you can do yourself. There is something that you can train, whatever. If you have a clinic and have therapists, but if you visualize this idea, say, for example, I don't know, 1,000, and I'll take a number of, say, 1,000 working hours, right? If you need 1,000 working hours and you want to deliver them in a professional way through the physical therapist, this is a very expensive thing.
Yeah.
Right. So you see, you know, You can't make a therapist to, I don't know, work for, let's say, less than $50 an hour. So therefore, 1,000 hours will give you $50,000 just to do it, right? So, which cuts very dramatically the number of people who are able to afford it, and basically, you know, like your whole thing becomes very difficult. So, what was the next step? Is saying, oh,
Teach the parents.
that's it. You teach the parent because the parent is the one who has the time, but doesn't have the skill, which then transforms the way you do it next way, right? Because the parents, they I mean, yes, they are the only ones with time, but fundamentally, most of them, they don't want to do it, right? So they all want the miracle. They kind of do it semi-reluctantly, right? So you see, some of them grow to like it, but most of them do it semi-reluctantly. They still, want the miracle.
Yeah,
They are not.
because at the beginning it seems mumbo jumbo. You use soft balls.
Yeah. Of course, that's true. That's true. But that's kind of additional factor there, right? So you see, then you have the people who will have the time. You have the people who would have the stamina. It's a lot of additional kind of pre-qualifying factors there. But at the end of the day, at least what it gives you this ratio, right? So you see, I can spend, earlier days I spent like 50 hours a year, right? And then got 50 hours a year to train them in a small group, right? And then I got, well, let's say I would say spend 10 hours to train a parent, and then I would get 1,000 or like 500 or 1,000 hours per year. So I would be multiplying. So therefore, as a person, in that sense, as a researcher, I was, even today, right? I'm able to, let's say, if I follow, say, 500 kids a year, so that means that I have the luxury of observing, of what happens over, let's say, 250,000 hours, right? There's no way on earth that I'm able to deliver the 250,000 hours myself, right? But in this situation, when there are parents who are doing this work, I'm able to follow up on that 250,000 of hours. And so therefore, the time budgets, and like this means that if that has been happening for the last 20 years, right? So you see, that means that I have been sitting over the pile of information of, let's say, 5 million hours, right? So you see that I see the transformation processes, right? So you see, in that sense, I'm a lucky beneficiary of a huge body of those transformations, right? So you see, okay, this is the way that I kind of organized it, right? And on the one hand, it's a benefit of, this scale factor. It's a benefit of sort of direct relationship with the families and with the children and so on. But on the other hand, I mean, it meant that I sort of became the nobody, right? So you see, because when I was in Moscow and I was like working with my father's clinic, it was very straightforward social status, right? So you see, okay, that's a clinic, this is the department, you're kind of between the academia and between the clinic. So everybody, it's very easy to understand who you are, right? But now, I mean, then since I kind of changed this way, then you are nowhere, right? So you see, like, are you a therapist? No, I'm not, right? So you see, like, because I am training the parents. I mean, like, but the parents, they are not therapists. So it's like what you're doing is a home therapy. So therefore, that home therapy doesn't qualify as a therapy. So, because it's not delivered by their qualified professionals.
It is a brilliant idea. The concept is brilliant.
Okay, but you see, nowadays, you can probably say that this is the so-called Uberization or democratization of their processes, right? So you see, like, with some negative effects, but whatever. Uber was originally, or Airbnb.
You stay anonymous while you stay.
So like, for example, the idea of the Airbnb, right, is that people have their spare bedroom, which is sitting, they could receive guests there if they have the platform which is going to help them, right? So it's the same idea there, right? So you see, I'm taking the idle hours of the parents, which are they are spending just doing care or doing something which is not very structured, or they kind of just do poorly. I structure those hours, I give them the the tools, the goals, and the supervision and so on, and they deliver it, right? But I don't have a place in the current format, right? So you see, in the current format, I am, not practicing as a therapist. I'm not practicing as whatever, as a practitioner. I'm not practicing, like as a part of academia. I'm kind of in between all of those, right?
But what did
So
you discover when it came? What is the central idea of this method? About about
I
the
mean, the central idea, you see, look, the thing is that I used to go, if you ask me in the way how it was, right? I used to do two things, right? So you see, I was looking at the agents of what would be the agents of this change, right? So what would be the agent? And my first ideas were very, very simple, I mean, in a way, I just looked at it from a very mathematical point, right? So you see, meaning that if we do something, right? So you see, in other words, and the first idea, the first kind of fundamental idea, actually belongs to my father. So my father was the person who actually kind of did the first flip, which was, you see, if you look at the spastic reality, right? So you see the spastic reality, which has the strong dominance of the, let's say, flexor side, right? So you see the flexion, contracture, and so on, right? And what everybody does, or everybody has been doing historically, like for generations and generations, is being their attempt to stretch, right? So you see, because the idea, it's too short, right? It's too short and too strong. So what we want to do, we want to deal with this element, which is too short and too strong, and try to make it longer. And if we don't manage to do it longer, so then we will try to weaken it by some poison injections, by cutting it and so on, right? And of course, partially, to a very little extent, there is also the idea, or, by the way, this flexor also has the extensor, but what do we do with this extensor? How do you train the extensor? Because basically, if the person is like that, they're not able to do the self-contractions. You can't actually ask them to start moving this hand, it just wouldn't do it.
So you have to strengthen the extensor?
You have to strengthen, at least at the very least. That's a very first simple idea, right? You see, well, look what happens if instead of trying to fight with the flexor, we're looking at the bigger picture and we try to do something, in the reciprocal unit, right?
So in the gym area, in the gym realm, they talk about the agonists, the antagonists.
Yeah. But that's the, you see, again, but the problem with them, when they talk about the agonists, they still refer to the contractions. They still refer to the, this muscle pulls here, this muscle pulls there, right? So you see, which, nowadays it's clear that this doesn't hold any water, right? So you see, like all these concepts which are related to the joint being stabilized by the muscle, this is, it's an absolutely ridiculous concept the moment you start looking at the timing of it, right? It sounds.
How are the bones and the joints stabilized? By what?
Yeah, but that's what I mean. But we're kind of detouring about it. But you see, look, fundamentally, the concept of the muscles stabilizing frictionless joint is absolutely ridiculous, right? Because it becomes ridiculous the moment you highlight that this is a frictionless joint and that muscles have timing and activation. You see, the moment you kind of separate the two and say, well, the muscles are holding it, but you put the activation aside, it sort of works, right? So you see, that's how biomechanics stand. They put the activation outside of the scope. But the fact is that, look, you have something which is fundamentally unstable, frictionless joints, right? Which has a huge difference between the, centripetal and the centrifugal, or the inner side and the outer side
Yeah,
of the anvil, right?
you call it the pit and the cleft.
The pit, the pit and the tip, yes.
The
So,
pit. Mm.
and you have to react at the impacts which are going to come from the outside, which are unpredictable.
I
So
see.
that means that you have to be able to react. But the muscles, most of them at best have a quarter-second activation. So that means that anything that happens faster than a quarter second is just going to ruin, there is going to be no balance, right?
That's right.
Because basically, like it's, for example, how would you know the kind of, if you look at sports, right? So you see all the sports greats. These are the people who have the talent not for strengths, but for super fast activations, right? So you see, like, whatever, what's the magic, I don't know, of,
Yeah.
Messi or whoever, right? Is that he is able to change the direction of the ball faster than that quarter second. So he's would be, maybe 10, 15, 20% faster than the defender in that activation mode.
Yeah,
Or in basketball,
you are talking about the activation of the muscle, not about the contraction of the, like.
It's just, it has to start with the activation. So, and that's the point. So that means that anything that happens before that, you are not able to control it. So the system has this huge gap. So if something happens if there is an impact that happens within a 1/10 of a second, and of course it can happen since it's an external point. So that means that the muscle has to be able to be fast enough to changing angular things, being able to respond to it with the numbers, which would be like 1/10 of a second, 1/20 of a second, and so on and so forth.
So the question is, how do you tap to this?
Well, that will bring us into other ideas, right? But first, that's why we will move from muscles to fascia and so on and so on. But this is the fundamental point, right? The fundamental point to begin with is that we have to understand that
this is what you said before about turning the vector, that what they do is they are losing information when they take the vector.
No, that was about the representation, but this is also true. But what I said that about in the representation via the measurement, which doesn't have the timing factor into it.
But here also, when you are looking at seconds and not in the quarter, what happens in the quarter of a second, then you lose information.
Well, which is true. So in other words, that means that this is something that you're not able to process.
Exactly.
So anything that is faster than that, you don't have the tools to process. So that's why. And something which is frictionless, you have to and that's the thing. So frictionless and as slow as quarter second doesn't go together. This is the important thing to just accept.
So if the movement is very slow,
if the joint is frictionless, that means that, this is where the fine parts are coming. What is instantaneous? What is, how quick is instantaneous? How stacked are those instantaneous changes and so on? So these are the tricky questions.
So how do you get access to these mysterious areas?
Well, you see, fortunately, things are much simpler. The body has figured it out a long time ago, right? So you see, basically, you maximize the distribution.
The distribution of what?
The distribution. So that's why you have that's where you go to the architecture. That's why it has to be the architectural distribution, right? So you see, that will bring us into the tensegrity and biotensegrity. It has to be embedded into the tonic factors rather than their movement and contraction factors, right? And it has to be tensional. It has to be because this is the thing about tension systems. Tension systems are capable of instant responses.
And when you say tensional systems, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, if we simplify it, it's the systems which have the elements which are being under tension.
So
tension.
In the body, where is the tension located?
Well, I mean, in that sense, tension and compression, it's not about, so you see, of course, we talk about the embodiments of the tension, but fundamentally, any fiber is going to be the system which could be under tension, right? So you see any...
So it's the same etymology of tonus, the word?
Yeah, like, okay, so the tone is, the tone is slightly different, right? So you see tension and compression. So these are the geometry, these are the geometries of the force action, right? So you see compression, tension is that against the elongation, right? So you see something which works against the elongation. So in that sense, we get back to the, these are the basics, tension and compression. But you see, we kind of, in my usual fashion, we took a detour, right? So the detour was that it was my father who actually said, okay, guys, look, if this is the hand which is twisted like this, so meaning we have two things to think about, length and activation. So the idea is based, fundamentally everyone believed that the muscle is like a rubber. So basically, if you just repeat the movement against the muscle, it's just going to get longer. But since it's alive, in fact, it's the other way around, because basically by trying to...
It recontracts.
Yeah, because by trying to stretch it, you actually activate it more, right? And if you activate it more, that means that the total representation imbalance only increases, right? So you see this part, let's call it the flexion side or the agonist side, whatever, right? So you see, for the sake of argument here. So this side is actually being represented even more, because basically by trying to, if I grossly simplified, right? So by trying to stretch this, so this is the element which is already working a lot and working hard, and this is the element which is not working, right? And by trying to stretch it here, you are effectively telling the brain, well, Mr. Brain, you're doing everything right. Keep
Go
up.
on. Yeah.
Go on. Hold even stronger, because you see, this is such an important thing. So you see, you've made your you did the good choices. You made the right priorities. So that was the brave move of my father, which was based on the ideas that actually, if you get the grip and kind of get additional component of the twist, tension, and so on, so that you would actually start activating it against, so that you will kind of get some tensional activation through the side, even if it means the elongation, right? So, and that was the basic, the ultimate barrier, because basically
it's a very old idea from the martial arts, from homeopathy.
Of course, but my father has been, in Greco-Roman wrestling and so on. So you see, in that sense, it's part of that experience, right? So you see, has been in Greco-Roman wrestling, Sambo, and all this other kind of stuff, right? So you see, for him, it was a natural thing. It just kind of, basically, what do we do to make it respond? Even, and that means
like when this is stuck, you even, in order to open it, you stuck it more, and then it is.
Well, you play with tension. Okay, we are less than 1 minute again, so I have to leave and we reconnect.
Sure.